So Job chapter 6, let's read together. Then Job answered and said, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash, for the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox low over his fodder? Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would fulfill my hope, that it would please God to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort. I would even exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait? What is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? He who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away, which are dark with ice and where the snow hides itself. When they melt, they disappear. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. The caravans turn aside from their course. They go up into the waste and perish. The caravans of Tema look. The travelers of Sheba hope. They are ashamed because they were confident. They come there and are disappointed. For you now have become nothing. You see my calamity and are afraid. Have I said, make me a gift? Or from your wealth offer a bribe for me? Or deliver me from the adversary's hand? Or redeem me from the hand of the ruthless? Teach me, and I'll be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray. How forceful are upright words. But what does reproof from you reprove? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? You would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Please turn, let no injustice be done. Turn now, my vindication is at stake. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity? Job here is, of course, responding to his friend Eliphaz. Eliphaz is the first of the friends to speak up, and you will find that in this book there are rounds of speeches. So what we have are 3 rounds of speeches. The first round is complete. All 3 friends are going to speak, and after each friend, Job will respond. The second round is the same. The third round is incomplete in the sense that only 2 of the friends are going to address Job, not the third. But this is the response of Job to the first speech of the first friend, Eliphaz. Let me remind us where we ended last time. If you recall that one of the things that Eliphaz did in the end of his speech to Job is to talk about what it means to be restored into right fellowship with God, what comes from being blessed or favored by the Almighty. One of the things that we said last week in our walk through Job chapter 5 is that Eliphaz often speaks truth, he just doesn't apply it in the right way. He misses in the application. That is certainly true at the end of chapter 5. Because Eliphaz speaks in a way that is concrete, in a way that is dogmatic, in a way that is prescriptive. If you love the Lord, if you're blessed by Him, if you have a relationship with Him, if you're reconciled to Him, then you'll enjoy this sort of life. This life that is protected by God, this life that is filled with His peace, this life that overflows with His fruitfulness. Eliphaz here is describing in the end of chapter 5 all the ways that God pours out grace and favor and mercy and blessing upon His people. Yet you remember, one of the things we had to drive down is that that's not exactly right, is it? Just because this is recorded in Scripture doesn't mean that it's precise, right? We have to draw the distinction. You have to look at who's speaking. This is Eliphaz speaking, and he's speaking in an authoritative way, and yet some of what he says is not exactly true. Eliphaz speaks in a way that seems to say if you have a right relationship with God, if you're blessed by Him, you'll never endure any hardship, never endure any suffering, never go through any trouble, that those things only come as a judgment of God upon men. But that's a lie. That's a health and wealth gospel. That's the prosperity gospel that is so widely believed today and yet is an abomination in the eyes of God. So what we did is we distilled from the end of chapter 5 some ways that we see the mercy of God displayed toward His people. These are not always true, right? You can have God in your life. You can have a right relationship with Him and still not experience these things. But if you experience these things in your life, you need to recognize them as a mercy of God toward you. And one of the things that we want to do proactively, and that hopefully this long difficulty that we're all walking through has taught us, is that we need to learn to be thankful for the ways that God protects us, for the ways that God provides for us. I mean, many times I've heard people say, well, my job hasn't been impacted, or my family's health hasn't been impacted. I hope as you acknowledge those things that you're giving thanks to God for them. So let me remind us of 4 ways that God often shows mercy to His people. Number 1, God shows mercy to us in that He often sustains our lives in times of want and war. One of the things that Eliphaz talked about is that people often nations often go through great hardships. We face national troubles. We go through economic decline. We go through poverty. We go through drought and famine. We go through war. And it is a mercy of God to us if we survive those things without great suffering. If we come through on the other side, if God preserves and protects our lives in the midst of everyone else experiencing great difficulty. Number 2, we said that God protects our hearts, if not also our reputations, from gossip and slander. One of the things that Eliphaz observed, he said that we would be hidden from the lash of the tongue. Now, I said this last Sunday night, I want to say it again. If you are easily offended by gossip and slander, that's probably a good thing. Just recognize that you're also guilty of gossip and slander. We're all guilty, okay? We all talk about people. Now, some of us talk about people more than others. Some of us are easily given to that particular sin, but every human being is prone to this. It's just the nature of living. And one of the things that we noted is that sometimes gossip and slander, even though we can't be completely protected from it, it happens, we're going to be talked about, God will protect our hearts from it. He will keep it from wounding us and destroying us and devastating us. That's good to know. Number 3, it's a mercy of God toward us in that God often gives us peace in our homes and watches over us lest we should be robbed. Remember that Eliphaz talked about how one of the graces of God, one of the mercies of God toward His people is that they could go home and not have to worry about having an intruder break in on them, that they could not have to worry about their livestock being stolen out of their fields. Again, it's not to say that it always is this way, but if you can go home and lay down in peace and not really be concerned about having an intruder break in on you, recognize that that's a mercy of God towards you. And then number 4, we said that God multiplies our families and gives us lives long enough to enjoy them. Not always true, but often the promise of the commandment that if we would honor our father and mother, that our days may be long upon the earth, often that comes to bear in that we get the opportunity to live a long life and to enjoy the blessing of family as God grows our families. As we come into chapter 6, we hear Job's response. Remember that Eliphaz he has spoken a lot of truth. Some of it he has applied in the right way, but a lot of it he has failed in his application. Job is now going to respond. We're going to break this down into 4 sections. So first we're going to look at verses 1 through 7, then verses 8 through 13, then verses 14 to 23, and then verses 24 to 30. And what you'll see is that Job begins by pleading his cause, right? The first thing that he's going to do is say, you don't exactly understand. I've got a reason to be as frustrated as I am. And then Job's going to move in this second part, and he's going to say, I really still have this desire. There's a longing in my heart that God would crush me. Right? That's still there. It's still present with Job. His suffering is still so great that he longs that God would destroy him. And then in this third movement, Job is going to turn to his friend and he's going to begin to critique. He's going to turn on Eliphaz and say, we had a commitment to one another. We're supposed to be friends. We're supposed to have this strong relationship. You're supposed to be there for me. And I find you lacking. And then in the end, Job is going to both invite Eliphaz's continued critique, while at the same time defending his walk with the Lord and saying, I still know right from wrong. I still know the will of God. I know that if what I'm experiencing is because of my sin or not. Prove me. And in this, we're going to talk about 2 things. We're going to talk about the importance of being able to admit your limitations, and then we're going to talk about what you need in a close friend. Those will be some of our applications tonight. So let's start in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 6, and I'll read it for us again. Job answered and said, Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore, my words have been rash, for the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox lope over his fodder? Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. Job begins by wanting to describe and wanting to remind his friend Eliphaz and his other friends. He wants to paint for them once again the portrait of his suffering. He wants to make sure that they understand what he's gone through. After all, Eliphaz has spoken in a way that seems to diminish what Job has gone through. Eliphaz has spoken in a way that is it's reduced what Job has suffered. Now, I don't think Eliphaz does that out of a desire to hurt Job. In fact, we talked about the fact that Eliphaz really does seem to want to help Job. He wants Job to come through this. He wants Job to have a right relationship with God. He wants Job to be vindicated. He wants him to be restored. And for Eliphaz, in the way that he views the world, there's only one category of suffering. Suffering is a consequence of sin. Job, you need to deal with the sin so that you can be right with God. So Job here is lifting back his suffering to the forefront and saying, let me remind you of just what I've lost. Without rehearsing the loss of his sheep and his camels, and without rehearsing the loss of his servants, without going through the loss of his 7 sons and 3 daughters, Job says, I wish we had a balance, a scale, right, that could weigh out what I have suffered. I want you to notice what he says in verse number 2. He says, Oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity laid in the balances. There's something about the way Job describes what he's been through. It's not just the losses themselves, it's also the toll that they've taken on him. There's a damage beyond the immediate loss of all of his financial resources. There's a damage beyond the loss of his children. There's a heartache of soul. There's the experience of a downtrodden spirit. There's the reality that the person, Job, feels as though he has been crushed beneath the weight of his loss. Job says, I wish that my vexation and my calamity could be weighed out. I wish that all the losses themselves, plus the toll they've taken on me, could be held in the balance. And then Job says, if we could do that, it would be awfully heavy, wouldn't it? What does he say? He says in verse 3, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Have you ever been to the beach with your little sand bucket or with your grandchild's sand bucket and dipped down some sand that's wet? There's a weight to it. There's a heft to it. It's the reason that when the waters begin to rise, we turn to sand to stave off a flood. Job says that's what it's like for what I've experienced. It would cause that scale, that weight, to just go right down to the bottom. I'm overwhelmed by what I've been through. And then Job says that all that he's been through has had an impact on the way that he responds, that he's reacted accordingly. Remember that Eliphaz said, and I think rightly so, we see in Eliphaz's assessment, Job, you've been through some hard stuff. You've walked through some difficult days. Job, you are enduring great suffering. But Job, Eliphaz said, you once had a walk with the Lord, and you once were such a bright, shining light to the people around you, and the minute that you faced suffering, the minute that you went through hardship, you just fell apart. And here is Job responding, saying, man, I had a reason to fall apart. He says in verse number 4, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Man, no wonder I'm talking the way I'm talking. No wonder I've had the reaction that I've had. This is Job standing up for himself. It's Job pleading his cause. It's Job saying, man, you have come down on me like a ton of brick upon my head, but I want you to understand the magnitude of what I've suffered. Don't you think I've got a reason? Now, we want to be careful here. Because just because Eliphaz makes the assessment of Job doesn't necessarily mean he's right. And just because Job defends his cause doesn't necessarily mean Job's right. This whole book is to be heavily nuanced. We've got to be careful as we move through it. I think Eliphaz was right. I think when Eliphaz said, Job, you've always been the first person to give the advice. The moment that you faced suffering, the advice went out the window and you started crying, woe is me. I think he's right. I think it's a hard word. I think it's a word that is biting. It's a word that cuts, but I think it's a word that was needed. Because I think Job does turn in the way that he cries out in Job chapter 3, longing for death, longing that he should have never been born. Job is experiencing a dark night of the soul, and he has shut off the light of the gospel in his life. And I think Eliphaz is the friend who's willing to stand and cut through that and force him to realize there's an imbalance in what you preach and what you practice. Nevertheless, Job is standing up for himself here and saying, I think I have a right to respond the way I have. Doesn't mean that he's right. It just is an explanation. This is Job pleading his own cause. Job lets us in a little more here. He says first in verse 4, he says, I see that this is God working in my life, working for my ill, working to destroy me, working to correct me, working to refine me, whatever it is. Job says God's behind it. Remember, at this point, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know why this has happened. We are privy to the details of the first 2 chapters in a way that Job is not. So Job says, I know God's behind this. There's no way that all of this suffering could have happened in my life if God wasn't involved in it. And it is painful. He says even it's poisonous. Right? It's like a poisoned arrow that's gotten its barb in me and all of a sudden is destroying me on the inside. And then Job says, verse 5, what else would I do but cry out? He compares himself here to the oxen and compares himself to donkeys. He says in verse 5, does the wild donkey bray when he has grass? Or the ox low over his fodder? Job says, take a look at the animals of the field, right? As long as the animals are content, as long as they've got what they need, as long as they're well fed and they've got plenty of room to roam, they're fine. When you hear the donkey bray, when you hear the oxen low, it is not because they are at pleasure. It's not because they have what they need. It's because they're in want. And Job says, all that I've been talking about is like the low of the oxen. It's like the braying of the donkey. I'm crying out in distress. Makes me think of Henry. Henry was the donkey that lived across the road from the parsonage when I lived down in South Alabama. I didn't know that Henry existed until I moved there and began to settle in. And the first few months of living in the country, there were lots of noises that always were filling the night. I'd sit there in the living room and hear the cattle, and I could hear the birds, and I could hear, just all sorts of things. But with time, those sounds begin to diminish. I never learned to ignore Henry. His bray was loud. It stood out. It cut through everything else. I could hear Henry braying long into the night. I finally figured out who his owner was, and I said, what is that? They said, that's Henry. I said, what? So they took me into the back pasture and they introduced me to Henry, who liked to break out of the fence and roam down Highway 6 in Conecuh County. But he always came home. He knew both his way out and in through that hole in the fence. Job says, I'm like that braying donkey, crying out. You Eliphaz, you my friends, y'all think that I'm overreacting. Job says, I think this is the logical response. Isn't it what anyone would do? Job also compares this experience of suffering to eating food without salt. He says in verse 6, can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. Job says that all this experience of hardship and suffering and trouble and pain, they're like a meal, a banquet feast has been set before me, but it's not anything I'd want, right? It's not mama's home cooking. It's not like I'm going down to Boland's and they're setting a plate full of barbecue in front of me that I can't resist. No, this is the worst stuff in the world to eat. This is what I don't want to partake of. It has no appeal to me. In fact, rather than being appealing, it turns my stomach, Job says. Eliphaz, listen to me. You're making light of what I've been through. I want you to hear me again, just how hard this has been on me. Job says, as he makes the transition into verse 8, that not only has this been hard on him, it still is. The suffering hasn't gone away. The pain is still there. His body and his spirit are still weak, and he still longs for a deliverance that he thinks can only come through death. Look at verse 8. He says, oh, that I might have my request, and that God would fulfill my hope. That it would please God to crush me, that He would let loose His hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort. I would even exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait, and what is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? Job begins here, and he talks about these difficulties that he's been forced to endure. And what Job is doing here in verses 8 through 13 is he is admitting, he's acknowledging, he is saying, I'm a man with limitations. I'm not made of steel. You can only push me so far. You can only bend me so much. I'm about to break. Job says in verse 8, oh, that I might have my request, that God might fulfill my hope. Don't those words sound hopeful, energetic, filled with a positive note? Job, he's got his sights set on something. He's got his teeth locked in on something. There's a longing that is driving him, but it's not for something that you and I would categorize as positive. It's not something that we would say is beneficial. We would not say that it would be good and a source of hope for one to be crushed. But Job says that's where he's put his hopes. All of his hope is in the promise, the prayer, the longing that God would crush him, that He would let loose His hand and cut him off. Can you imagine what it is to experience such a dark night of the soul that that's where your hope has stayed? That you have gotten so low in your life that you can't imagine deliverance except through death? That you've gotten so low in life that you can't imagine victory except through destruction? That you think the only way out is by the hand of God coming down to crush you, and you cannot imagine the hand of God coming to save you? One of the things that we have to do as we walk with Christ through difficult things, through hard times and troubling situations, and should we ever find ourselves like Job, having God pour on us personal pain in order to prove that we are His, is we have to learn to examine our faith. We have to learn to take stock of where we are in relationship to God, and to acknowledge that we only see in part when He sees the whole. That's why we don't look at this and say, well, Job is right to say this. It's why we don't give in to the feelings and the emotions and the compulsive nature of Job's suffering. It's why we don't just listen to Job and say, yeah, man, you're right. Man, the only way for you is to be crushed. Because ultimately, brothers and sisters, we know that the only way for Job is not for him to be crushed. The only way for Job is for the Son of God to be crushed for him. The only way for you and I to have out of our suffering, out of our trial, out of our problems, out of our pain is not that we should be set free from this life. It is that God sent His Son to die for us, so that in the life to come we might be free forever. Job doesn't have that perspective. His trouble is so great, his problems are so vast, his suffering is so intense, that he says, all my hope is stayed on this one thing, that God would crush me. Job even puts a positive spin on it, doesn't he? Look at verse 9. He says, that he would fulfill my hope, that it would please God to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. Verse 10, this would be my comfort. Why? For I would exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. In other words, Job is saying here, I am being pushed to the brink. I cannot long endure. I am about at the edge of my rope. I can't go on much longer. What I need is for God to step in and destroy me, and I would be exceedingly glad about that, because at least I would die without having cursed his name. Brothers and sisters, this is not the position you want to be in. This is not something we look at and should say, well, that's a natural way of responding, or that's a healthy way of responding. There's nothing healthy about this. But it is real. And this does remind us that, number one, God can handle our honesty. And number two, that only in being honest can we begin to find a pathway to healing. Job says, I wish that I could go ahead and die. At least then I wouldn't curse God. And then Job invites his friends, who have been so critical and will be so critical in the coming passages. He invites his friends to consider his limitations. Look at verse 11. He says, what is my strength that I should wait? What is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? In other words, Job is saying, am I made of steel? Do you think I can handle just anything? Do you think that on my own, in the flesh, I'm capable of long enduring? Don't you know my limits? And isn't there woven into Job's address to his friend also a cry to the Holy One? God, don't you know my limits? I remind us of this. We've talked about it before. We will talk about it again. Every Sunday morning when we come together as a church, we rub shoulders with people who are on the edge. We talk to people, we interact with people, we sit in Sunday school with people, we sit next to people in worship who are on the edge, who are at the brink. Now their edge may be a lot closer than yours. They may not be able to handle near as much as you can. But brothers and sisters, when we gather together, everybody may look like they're fine. Everybody might say they're doing okay. Everybody might be willing just to come in and put a smile on and go out and carry their problems with them without ever talking about them. But understand that all around us are people who are living on the edge, who are almost at the point of destruction, who are on the brink of woe, and who are crying out, if not audibly, there is a deep cry of the soul saying, can I long endure? What do you think I'm made of? And I hope that as we recognize that, we would see that God places us in their paths, not to push them over, but to hold them back. And Job is at the point of destruction, and all he thinks is that his friends are pushing him over, and all he wants is for someone to hold him back. Look at verse 13. He says, have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? Here we're reminded that Job's suffering is twofold, right? His suffering is body and soul. That there's all that he's lost in terms of his person, in terms of his spiritual nature, in terms of the inner man. But there's also all that he's lost in terms of the outer man. He's lost his sons and daughters. He's lost all of his financial resources. And here Job says, you seem to think that I ought to get up on my own. You seem to think that I ought to pull myself up by my bootstraps. And as Eugene Peterson says in the Message, you want me to pull myself up by my bootstraps when I don't even have boots anymore. It's all gone. You want me to use my resources, and I don't have any resources left, Job says. Let me talk to you for a minute about admitting your limitations. Let me give you 3 reasons that you ought to admit your limitations. Job here in these verses 8 through 13, is being rather honest with us, isn't he? He is saying to his friends and to his God, I am not without limits. I cannot do this on my own. I am at the brink. I think one of the greatest struggles that we have in American Christianity is that we live in a culture of self-made men, and we value that so much that sometimes we think in the church of God we have to be self-made as well. I can handle it on my own. I don't need to admit my need of assistance. I don't need to admit my need of a Savior. I don't need to admit that I struggle with sin and that I can't exactly get control of this one on my own. I could use some help. So let me remind us of the benefits, of reasons that we should admit our limitations. Number 1, admitting your limitations underscores that the solution is not just something done in you or to you, but something done for you. I've been reminded in recent days that one of the dangers in the way that we do church, when we talk about the gospel, when we bring that to bear on people's lives, is that we sometimes skirt a dangerous message that says, what God wants to do is make you a better you. What God wants to do is help you to live a better life. Brothers and sisters, I hope you understand, and if you don't, listen to me now. God doesn't want to make a better you. He wants to make a new you. And the gospel is not about something that's done in you, and it's not about something that is done to you. It is about something that is done for you. The gospel is not about Jesus Christ coming alongside you and being your running buddy and helping you endure in the race. The gospel is not about Jesus Christ coming and waving some wand over you that all of a sudden gives you power that you've never had before. The gospel is about the death of who you are as a sinner and the life that God creates in you by the finished work of His blessed Son, Jesus Christ. His righteousness given to you by faith. And the only way that you and I can make room in our lives for a gospel that is for us is to admit our limitations. When we come to the end of ourselves and we say, I cannot do it on my own, then we underscore, I don't have to because it's been done for me. Let me just go back to what we talked about this morning. I know several people recently, lots of conversations, people said, man, you've been on it recently. These are hard words to hear. I hope you understand they're not just hard words for the people, they're also hard words for the preacher. But the reason that they're hard words is because they are truths that show us just how sinful we are. But that should not destroy us or break us. It should drive us to the cross. If you think that you can begin with Jesus at the cross and not finish with Jesus at the cross, then you haven't understood the gospel. It's not Jesus at the beginning and then me on my own at the end. It is Jesus for me from first to last. So why do I need to be a person who can admit my limitations? It's so that I underscore that my salvation is not something done in me or to me, but something done for me. Number two, and all of these are connected. Number two, when we admit our limitations, we create space in our life to not only accept, but to ask for help. To not only accept, but to ask for help. Now, some of us, we are not even real good at accepting help, and I'm one of them. I've got this problem. I'm talking to myself. Because we get up in the morning and we go about our business and we think we can do it on our own. If there's only enough hours in the day, we'll get it done. And usually we don't have to go very far to realize we cannot do it on our own. When we admit our limitations, we create space in our lives to accept help. But then you can go a step further. We create space in our life to ask for help. I can't help but think here, if you haven't seen this, it's really worth seeing. There's a program on Netflix called The Crown, and it's about the life of Queen Elizabeth II. It's really good. It's well done. And in that, there is a scene where they're talking about Prince Charles going off to a boarding school, and they're flashing back to Prince Philip having gone to boarding school as a child. And in that, of course, there's the experience of Prince Philip, who lost his sister in a plane crash, and his mother had some mental illness and all sorts of other things, and he really was alone. And he's gone to the funeral, and he comes back to this boarding school, and he's so overwhelmed with grief. And he's been given a task by the headmaster of the school to build a gate at the entrance to this campus. And Prince Philip, he's there, and he's trying to move these great big bricks and set up this gate, and he's trying to do all the things to build this gate and have it in place, and he's doing all of it by himself, and he works so hard, and his hands are bloody, and he's pouring sweat, and he's beaten up, and he does it all through the night, days on end, and he can do everything. But then he comes to the last piece, which is to hang these massive iron gates. And try as he might, he cannot do it. And so finally he hobbles, broken, into the big dining hall where every other kid and all the professors are eating. And he asks for help. And only then does the headmaster give the nod for all of the boys to go out in his place and do for him what he couldn't do for himself. Brothers and sisters, we are like that in our lives. Often struggling to do things on our own and unwilling to admit our need. But if we can ever admit we have limitations, we can't do it all on our own. We're not made of steel. We are not Superman. Then we create space in our life to be able to both accept and to ask for help. Then number three, and I've alluded to this, but when we admit our limitations, we promote a continued dependence upon the grace of God from first to last. Thank you. When we admit our limitations, we promote a continued dependence upon the grace of God from first to last. It is this idea, and it's been said by so many people, I wouldn't even begin to give attribution, but the gospel is not the ABCs of Christianity. It is the A to Z of Christianity. It is the whole of our experience. If I start as a little child in Sunday school hearing the truth of Jesus' sacrifice upon the cross, and that is the way for me to be saved from my sins, that is the same truth that I can latch hold of and depend on, that I should also be hearing when I get to the class from which the only promotion is to eternity. And sometimes we come to church and we make little of the gospel because we say, I've heard that before. I've heard it before. I've heard it before. And my dear friend, you need to hear it again, because there's never a time when you are not dependent upon Jesus and what he's done for you. Look at verse 14. So here Job begins to really charge his friend. He says, "He who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away, which are dark with ice, and where the snow hides itself. Where they melt, they disappear. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. The caravans turn aside from their course. They go up into the waste and perish. The caravans of Tema look, the travelers of Sheba hope. They are ashamed because they were confident. They come there and are disappointed, for you have now become nothing. You see my calamity and are afraid. Have I said, make me a gift? Or from your wealth offer a bribe for me? Or deliver me from the adversary's hand? Or redeem me from the hand of the ruthless?" Job says here to his friend, "I was counting on you." Now again, remember, this is Job's assessment of his friends. And in Job's assessment, he was counting on them. And the language here indicates that they had a pact. That they had a covenantal relationship. That word there in the beginning, when it says, "He who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty." That word kindness it's hesed, the covenant love, the covenant kindness, the covenant grace. It's the same word that's used about the grace of God toward His people Israel. Job is saying, we had a bond, man. We had an agreement. We had a pact. You were supposed to be there for me, and I'm supposed to be there for you, and you have stood around and acted like you were going to be there. You've touted your friendship, and the second I get in trouble, you're gone. What's he talking about? Because clearly, Eliphaz showed up. Clearly, the friends made an agreement, and they came at an appointed time. So when Job says, "I needed you and you were gone," what's he talking about? Well, for Job, it's a failure of Eliphaz to demonstrate the kind of covenant love or covenant kindness or covenant grace that he expected his friend to extend. In other words, he's saying, my friend showed up, but he acted in a completely unexpected way. It says in verse 14, "He who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty." In other words, it's a part of loving God that you can love people. And not just love them in a general way, but love them in a specific way. Love them in a way that comes to bear on their circumstance. Love them in a way that meets them in the trouble that they have. Anybody can walk away from a friend. Anybody can fail to be there in a difficult moment. The real friend is the one who shows up when everything gets tough. And Job says, you weren't there. He says in verse 15, "My brothers," now do you see how close he counts them? He counts his friends as brothers. He says, "My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away." And then he begins to paint a picture for us. And he says it's sort of like this. Before times got tough, before all this trouble hit, before I began to suffer, when everything was going all right, the friendship that I had with Eliphaz and my friends, the friendship I was counting on, the covenant we made together, was like the snow on top of a mountain. It was there. It was faithful. We knew that when the time came, when the season of trouble came, it would be there as flowing water to bring renewal to me. But then Eliphaz says then Job says the heat came and began to melt that icy snow cap. And he says rather than the water coming down to the valley below where it's needed, where the trouble is, where the suffering is, where the drought is, instead it melted and dissipated like a vapor in the wind. Eliphaz said, your proposed friendship was so great, it was like a mirage. It drew in the caravans. It drew in the travelers. People looked at it and said, oh, there's an oasis. It's something that everybody could see. It was so well talked about, but then they got there and found it to be nothing. Just a mirage. Something gone in a moment. Eliphaz says, man, I've been counting on you. Or Job says, I've been counting on you, Eliphaz, and you weren't there for me. And then Job, he moves in verse 22. Look there. He says, I don't understand this because I haven't asked for much, right? He says, I didn't ask you to give me anything. I didn't ask you to pay somebody off for me. I didn't ask you to come and rescue me from someone who had possession of me. I didn't ask you to redeem me from the hand of the ruthless. Job says, I don't understand why your covenant love, your covenant grace, your covenant kindness, I don't understand why your friendship is gone when it's needed, because, my goodness, I haven't asked that much of you. You know, everything comes back to Jerry Clower, and this does too. Jerry Clower told the story about the man who was having a conversation with his friend. And he said to his friend, he said, John, if you had $100, would you loan me $50? And John said, Bill, you know I'd loan you $50. I love you. You're my friend. We've been able to count on each other. Of course I'd loan you $50. Bill looked at John and said, John, if you had 2 hogs, would you give me 1 hog? And John said, Bill, now you know that ain't fair. You know I've got 2 hogs. Job says, I was counting on my friend to be there. And I didn't ask for much. All I needed was his presence. All I needed was his offer of peace. All I needed was his willingness to listen. All I needed was his willingness to hear me out. And Job says, I feel like I've been turned on. As we think about that, we recognize that this is the danger, as we said last week, of possessing the truth but applying it wrongly. You can know all the facts, you can know all the truth of Scripture, and if you apply it in the wrong way, you can do so much trouble, so much destruction. It's possible you can't even see redemption after it. As we think here for just a moment, let me offer to you 4 qualities I think you need in close friends. Clearly, Job and Eliphaz are in a tight spot here. They're having struggle over what real friendship is, and so this causes me to think of 4 qualities that we need in close friends. Number 1, you need a close friend who walks closely with Jesus. I hope you understand by now as you walk with the Lord that while we'll have friends who aren't believers, we'll have relationships with people who are outside of Christ, our closest relationships ought to be with people who are in the kingdom. You need a friend who knows Jesus well, because everything about how you interact will flow out of that. The way that you minister to one another, the way that you care for one another, the way that you offer correction to one another, the way that you seek redemption and offer or receive forgiveness when you've had a falling out, it will all flow out of that person's relationship with Christ. So you need a friend who walks closely with Jesus. Number 2, you need a friend who cares deeply about you. You need a friend who cares deeply about you. There are a lot of people who know your name. There are a lot of people who know where you live. There are a lot of people who remember you from high school, or remember you from your early working days, or remember you from some social gathering that you were a part of. But those people may or may not be your close friends, because what you need are people who care about you. You need the people who call and check. You need the people who write the card. You need the people who show up out of the blue. You need the people who will drop everything and come. The older you get, I hope the more you've been able to understand that just because somebody knows me doesn't mean I count them in my circle. Because you need a friend who is close to Jesus and a friend who cares deeply about you. Then number 3, you need a friend who listens more than he speaks. You need a friend who listens more than he speaks. And of course, all these qualities then turn on you. You've got to be this kind of person. But sometimes we find ourselves like Job. Say, man, all I asked, all I wanted was for you to listen. I didn't need all the advice. I didn't need all the story. I didn't need all of the judgment. I just needed someone who would show up and listen. You need a friend who will listen more than he speaks. Number 4, this is important. You need a friend who will stay when things get tough. I've had cause to think about this in recent days. I've had some friends who are going through some difficult matters back home, and had some people call and say, well, how are they doing? Or, we know you're in an awkward place because you're friends with them. And I found myself repeatedly saying to those who've questioned, my friendship doesn't run. It's there. These are people who've been good to me. These are people who've been loyal to me. These are people who've shown up when I found myself in need. These are people who didn't judge me when I made a mess of things, but were right there with God's grace to love me through it. So I'm going to be there for them. Where I can, I'll point them to the gospel. Where I can, I'll show them how they need to bring correction to their lives. Where I can, I'll bring a word of instruction to them. But mostly, I'm just going to be there. You need a friend who'll stay when things get tough. Look at these last verses as we get ready to close. Verse 24, Job says now, after rebuking his friend Eliphaz, he says, teach me and I will be silent. Make me understand how I've gone astray. How forceful are upright words. But what does reproof from you reprove? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? You would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Please turn and let no injustice be done. Turn now, my vindication is at stake. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity? Job says to his friend, you've been going on and on with these words of correction. And I'm here to tell you, you can't bring correction when you don't know what you're correcting. Job is still here, and rightfully so, defending himself, saying, it's not a sin issue that's behind all of this. He says, everything else about me is a mess, but I've still got my palate. Or in other words, I've still got my bearings. I know right from wrong. I know good from evil. I know what God is up to. And I may not know everything about this, but I know this. This suffering is not owed to my sin. So Eliphaz, you've been jabbering on, and I don't really want to hear it. And the reason I don't want to hear it is not because I'm not willing to receive correction. It's because you don't know what you're talking about. He goes a little further than that, doesn't he? He says in verse 26, do you think you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? In other words, what Job is doing here, listen to this. Job is going to the attitude of Eliphaz. Job is saying, I've listened to you, and the way that you're talking to me, you're discrediting me. You're discounting what I've been through. You act like my suffering doesn't matter. He makes that explicit in verse 27. He says, you'd even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. In other words, Job is saying, Eliphaz, you don't have a positive outlook on life. You don't look at people as objects of the Father's love. You don't see people as men and women created in the image of a holy God. You see us as just things to be discarded. And the way you've talked to me, the way that you've responded to my hurt, to my pain, to my hardship, to my suffering, it's as if it didn't matter at all to you. Why in the world would I listen? There's a lesson there. You might want to step in and offer a word of correction. You might want to step in and offer a word of instruction. But you don't have the foundation to do either in the life of your friend until you've shown them that you care about what they're going through. One of the things that I constantly am thinking about as a pastor is the connection between what I preach on Sunday morning and how I lead throughout the week. And this is the reason that I push back so strongly against one of the models of church that is so prevalent in our day, this model of a detached church where we have satellite campuses and one minister who preaches to thousands and thousands of people, because I wonder how in the world can we adequately and aptly preach the Word of God to the people of God when we don't even know who we're preaching to. I earn the right to preach week by week when I pastor week by week, when I demonstrate that I care, when I learn about your lives, when I take interest in who you are. That is the same in smaller ways. Sunday school teachers, you want to know how you'll get the authority to act in your classes and to have leadership over your people and to bring the Word of God to bear on their lives? Show that you care. Demonstrate your love. Right now, when we're scattered so far abroad, call your people, send cards to your people, make sure that they know that you care. Job's charge against Eliphaz doesn't center on the fact that he's unwilling to receive a word of correction. It centers on the fact that the one who's doing the correcting has demonstrated that he doesn't actually care. You discard me, Job says, like an orphan, like someone who's on the outskirts of society, like someone who can be overlooked. And yet Job demonstrates that he does desire to stand right before God. So he says in verse 28, "Now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face." There's an invitation here. There's an opening of himself here. Job is saying, Eliphaz, I want you to do the work. I want you to look at me. I want you to examine me. I want you to offer a word of correction. There's nothing held back. There's no part of my life that isn't on display. But I'm telling you, you want to bring a word of correction. You want to bring a word of instruction. You want me to be vindicated at the last. And I'm just telling you, verse 30, I think I still know right from wrong. I contend this isn't my fault, that there's something else going on here. Eliphaz, why don't you take a look at me and find out if there's something more? As we walk through this book, it's heavily nuanced. We're in the position of the friends. We're in the position of Job. We're hearing them speak. And then we're diving down to think, how does this actually mesh with the gospel? And as you walk away from Job's response, recall that the reason that he is so harsh in his response to his friend is because his friend was so wrong in his application of the truth. Remember that the only way for real reconciliation is to do exactly what Job's done. To say, I know my limitations and I'm there. I'm not made of steel. I can't long endure this. And when you're building your friends, make sure you pick some people who walk with the Lord and who care about you and who listen more than they speak, and who will be there when times get tough.